Let's bring in now geopolitical strategist Tina Fordham, the founder of Fordham Global Foresight. Tina, thank you for joining us in the studio to talk through this subject and the potential implications for Russia and the West and, of course, the domestic opposition, to what extent that still remains in Russia. What is the potential meaningful repercussion that could come through from the US and the US allies to the passing of Navalny? Is the toolbox empty for the West, or is there meaningful punishment that can be laid at Russia's door?
Well, this is what President Biden had said in the past, that if Navalny were to die in custody, which is what has clearly happened, that there would be a price to pay. And we also heard the very emotional speech from Navalny's widow at the Munich Security Conference talking about justice. I think the unfortunate reality is that there are unlikely to be very many policy triggers that can be pulled to punish Russia further. But that does not mean that Navalny's death is without significance. It's not a market-moving event, but it is a major signpost in Russia's political trajectory and in the way that it will be engaging with the West.
Does it embolden Putin? Is this a Vladimir Putin who is more emboldened because of the relative successes that have come through in the last few months on the ground for Russian forces? Or is there a risk, longer term, if not now, that Navalny becomes a martyr to which opposition gravitates?
Well, Navalny already is a political martyr, right? I mean, he wasn't a saint, but he is now a political martyr. But he's one in a very long line, unfortunately, of opposition politicians who've been murdered, going back to Anna Politkovskaya, who was assassinated on Putin's birthday, to Alexei Litvinenko, who, of course, was poisoned here in the UK. This is just the most recent one. And the regime in Russia kills with impunity and also with cruelty. We're seeing that his body apparently is missing in this remote Arctic prison. It's at the morgue. It's not at the morgue. The cruelty is part of it. Putin is playing us in the West, and I think it's important to understand that. It was only a few days ago that U.S. journalist Tucker Carlson was there, famously talking about the supposedly glorious state of Russian supermarkets and the indeed very majestic Moscow metro. I lived in Moscow for years. All of that is true. But we have elections coming up in Russia in March. What are the repercussions for Putin of this? They are probably minimal, but in concrete terms, the existing measures under discussion, like redeploying Russian assets and transferring them to Ukraine, will gain more momentum. It's hard to see how much more can really be done on sanctions. But just as the war in Ukraine brought more members into NATO, I think we will see much more defense spending as well.
OK, you touch on the US and the narrative amongst some sections of the Republican Party, some sections of the right, around their views on Putin and Putin's Russia. Is this likely to change that narrative even at the margins? Is it likely to do anything to change the debate around the spending package that remains held up in Washington?
Well, these are two different things, right? So those who lionize Putin and who, sort of glorify the supposed strength of autocrats are not likely to be put off by the death in custody of an opposition figure, right? I mean, even Tucker himself said at the World Government Summit that leaders have to kill people, which is quite a remarkable thing for an American journalist to say. The question about whether U.S. military aid to Ukraine will pass in the House is a different one, right? So if we look at U.S. public opinion, data from the Pew Foundation shows us that 74% of Americans believe that it's important and in U.S. national interest to support Ukraine. We also know that a straight up and down vote in the House of Representatives would pass, but the Speaker won't allow that to happen. So the question should be, why not? And the only explanation that I can come up with is that the political repercussions are actually coming from President Trump, who's almost seems to be a president in waiting at the moment in terms of his influence on the policy agenda in the House of Representatives.
So wielding power already, even if he is, if he's
certainly
not,
wielding
not in
influence.
Wielding influence.
Yeah, over
Certainly
what can happen.
Right,
and
and
the longer the conflict takes, the more it plays into Putin's hands, the more the European security risk premium goes up as a result.
So what ultimately brings Putin to the negotiating table then?
Well, I mean, we know from the history of conflicts that they end when one side gets tired, whether that's having, sacrificed too much in blood or treasure. We're really not at that point. For Ukraine, it's an existential crisis. Public opinion in Ukraine does not support territorial concessions. And, of course, there's no evidence that Ukraine giving up territory would end this conflict anyway. Putin wanted to take the entire country, not to keep Crimea. He already had that in effect. So there's no incentive, as I see it, for Putin to go to the negotiating table until there's an outcome in U.S. elections in November. Former President Trump has already indicated his allegiance or support for the Russian regime. And this is true of not only the conflict in Ukraine, but elsewhere. There'll be a lot of world leaders or non-state actors who are going to wait and see what happens in the White House on the possibility that conditions for negotiation will be more advantageous. That's a rational strategy.
OK, Tina Fordham, thank you very much indeed. Always bringing the smart analysis on this topic for us. The founder of Fordham Global Foresight and all the events that unfolded over the last few days in Russia, Ukraine, and, of course, the implications of Navalny's death more broadly and longer term. Thank you.